If you came to this channel hoping I'd tell you that avoidants are the problem, that they ruin every relationship, that they're cold, emotionally unavailable, and not worth your time to date, you might be a little bit disappointed by the end of this video. I get you. I get you because I think you got there through some hard experiences, and I understand why you feel this way. But I want to take a human approach, right? So for me, I'd like to connect with people who want to connect with me. Whether those people are avoidants, whether they're anxiously attached, whether they're anxiously disorganized, whatever they are, if they want to connect with me and they want to put in the work, I'm going to show up for that. And I'm going to put their attachment style aside. I think avoidants are really easy to villainize because they're the ones pulling away, they're shutting down, they're going quiet. They retract themselves from the conversation when things get difficult in a relationship. And because they're the ones who seem distant and detached and unavailable, it's easy to think that they're the bad guy. And when you're coming from an anxious perspective, that kind of behavior, it does feel like abandonment. It can even feel like cruelty from the other person. So it makes sense that in a lot of content out there, the avoidant is always cast as a villain. It's some pretty serious typecasting. But that's not what we're going to do here because I think real life is a little bit more complicated than that. And honestly, oversimplifying these dynamics, especially by just blaming one person, all it does is just keep us stuck. So in this video, I want to talk about why avoidants are not the villain in anxious avoidant relationships. And also what's actually driving the pain in this very common, and very messy dynamic. Hi, I'm Madalena, and this is You Reclaimed. Around here, we talk a lot about how childhood trauma, emotional dysregulation, ongoing anxiety, how these things affect how we connect to people, our identity, and how we show up in the world. And we do this so that we can live our lives on our own terms.
Wait, did you subscribe yet? I have a lot more to share, and I'd love to have you here for it. It really helps my channel grow, and I appreciate it so much.
So let's talk about why avoidants get blamed so often in the first place. One big reason is that anxious attachment, it looks like a lot of effort is being made. It looks like you're fighting for the relationship, like you're reaching out, you're trying to connect to your partner. You're trying to be the glue that holds all the things together. Meanwhile, avoidant attachment looks like the opposite of that. It looks like it sucks, right? On the outside, it doesn't look appealing. It looks like withdrawal and a lack of care and like you're creating distance instead of trying to bridge the gap, and you're avoiding intimacy, maybe even trying to end the relationship. So yeah, from the outside, one person looks like they're doing everything they can to make it work, and the other one looks like they're just chronically trying to run away. But that's not the full story. The truth is always a little bit more complex than that, right? Both people are doing what their nervous system has been wired to do under emotional stress. One person clings to the other or to the relationship, and the other one retreats. Both people are reacting out of fear. But because our culture tends to, let's say, encourage connection at all costs, let's not go as far as saying to glorify connection, because we do encourage connection, and you can see it in the constant assumption that everything in life becomes better with a partnership, with a relationship. Sometimes we have an unspoken sort of allergy towards being single, and relationships always fixing everything. No, that's not true, right? Sometimes everything becomes harder when you're in the wrong partnership. But because we're so focused on partnership, the anxious partner gets painted as the hero, as the one who cares more about their partner and about the relationship because they want it so much, while the avoidant person becomes the villain in every single story. They're the ones who can't handle love. They're the ones who sabotage everything. But the problem with this framing is that it completely erases the unhealthy behaviors on the part of the anxiously attached person, and it completely erases how the dynamic fits together, which is also important. But if you've ever been in a relationship with someone who's deep in their anxious attachment, you know that it can be just as destructive in its own way. We're talking about chronic jealousy, about emotional reactivity, which can do a lot of damage, needing more attention and reassurance than any one person or relationship can reasonably provide you with. And making the relationship all about soothing yourself, right? Instead of about building real connection. If that kind of high anxiety goes unchecked, if the person doesn't know how to calm their own system, it can wreck even the strongest partnership. And we're not putting blame here. We're not saying the person doesn't want to fix themselves. We're saying that it's difficult to figure these things out. I know because I've been there myself, and because I've seen my anxiously attached friends eroding their relationships from the inside out with needs that no person can meet. Neither of these two patterns, left unchecked and unconscious, creates healthy connection. Both styles come with behaviors that can stress and sabotage and slowly kill the relationship. So it's not about who hurts the relationship more. It's about how each person contributes to this dynamic and whether each person is willing to work on their own part. So anxious attachment is not necessarily healthier just because it looks like it wants connection. When you're anxiously attached, you might fight to keep the relationship alive, but that doesn't mean you're building something healthy. It does mean that your default safety is in connection, and that's really important. So you're always going to work harder than the avoidant for that connection. But that doesn't mean that you're not sabotaging the relationship through the side door at the same time. Because when you're anxiously attached, you might do all kinds of things like overreact to small criticisms, spiral over misunderstandings, get clingy or jealous when there's no real reason to be, or demand connection so intensely that all it does is work towards destabilizing the whole relationship. And often it's the anxious partner who becomes overly critical and emotionally reactive, which ends up pushing their partner further away, especially if that partner is avoidant or even securely attached. So, if we define a successful relationship by how long two people stay together, the anxious person might look like the winner because they're the ones trying to hold it together at all cost. But if we go a little further and we define success by how healthy and stable and fulfilling the relationship is, then neither style is automatically better. Both can do so much damage. The anxious partner might demand more closeness than the relationship can possibly handle. And the avoidant partner might pull away so often that the relationship loses all sense of safety and connection. But neither one of these attachment styles is inherently bad. They're just running different versions of the same survival script, and they're blaming each other for it in the process, which is why it's such a stressful connection to begin with. Let me give you a real example. In my own marriage, we started out in a classic avoidant anxious dynamic. I leaned anxious, he leaned avoidant. I was actually anxious, disorganized, so I swung all over the place, but connected to my husband, I leaned more anxious. Classic, right? And in the beginning, things were very, very hard. The more anxious I became, the more he went in the other direction. And the more he pulled away, the more I insisted. And the more I insisted, the more overwhelmed and shut down he became. It was a loop, and it was incredibly exhausting. I think it took us 1 or 2 years to even get to the bottom of what was happening. I mentioned this in one of my older videos about anxiety, but for a long time, my typical reaction to conflict was to overtalk and to try and talk it out forever like a good little anxious person, right? And my husband's pattern was to shut down for exactly 3 days. And until those 3 days were up, we were not getting anywhere. It frustrated me to absolutely no end. I had no idea how to handle that with another human being. But over time, we talked about it gently. He explained why he needed those 3 days to think. I explained how hard it was not to know what was happening in his head. And eventually, with effort, we did figure out a rhythm. We didn't come to it easily, but we did figure something out. I couldn't push so hard to resolve everything right away because that was my instinct. And he couldn't just lock me out without letting me know that more conversation was coming down the road. And you might be tempted to think that we figured out some kind of magical resolution to this problem, but we didn't. We just started building trust slowly, the way real trust is built between two people, not just in each other, but in the connection itself. We started to trust that we were creating something together and that we were choosing each other for a reason in the first place. And slowly we both started to move toward the middle of the scale, right? But it was a joint effort. And we still dance around sort of the middle where secure attachment lies, but we're not perfectly secure all the time. I don't think many people are. But the dynamic is no longer completely polarized as it tended to be in the beginning between us. And here's something I really want you to hear. In his previous relationships, my husband had leaned much more secure. Why? Because his other partners didn't trigger the same patterns I did, because I was highly anxious. Actually, I started out anxious disorganized. So when he got in a relationship with me, someone who was highly dysregulated all the time, as I was back then, almost 20 years ago, his avoidant side came out more strongly. He had no choice. He had to protect himself, I think. And the same thing happened to me in other relationships. I had sometimes leaned avoidant, especially with previous partners who were highly anxious, because I couldn't take that much connection either. When I was chronically dysregulated, I swung between the two sides like a wild pendulum. So this stuff is not exactly etched in stone. It's relational. It changes depending on the dynamic between two people and depending on how self-aware each person is. That's why I don't agree with the idea that avoidants are hopeless or you shouldn't date anyone who's an avoidant. That kind of thinking just keeps you stuck. That being said, there is a very real problem, and we need to talk about that by the end of this conversation because it's at the core of this video. The real issue in these dynamics is not whether someone is anxious or avoidant. The real issue is whether both people are willing to grow and be self-aware. You can be with someone who leans avoidant, and if they love you, if they want to be in the relationship and they're trying to look at their own patterns, right? At how they show up and they are doing the work, that can turn into a fantastic relationship. And at the same time, you can be with someone who's completely secure in their attachment style. And if they're disinterested or dismissive of you because they're just not in, because they simply are not invested, or they're unwilling for whatever reason to show up emotionally or to show up physically, then that will be a disaster of a relationship. It will not be safe or fulfilling either, no matter how secure that person is. Willingness always matters more than style. If there's anything I want you to take from this conversation, it's that willingness comes first, before any attachment style. Avoidant is not the problem. Unwillingness is. The inability to look at yourself, the inability to be self-reflective in any way. So an avoidant who doesn't care, who doesn't want to work with themselves, yeah, that's a deal breaker. The disinterest in growing as a human being and doing better than you did yesterday, that's the real problem. So a person who's not going to take responsibility for themselves and who's not going to do something differently when their behavior or when their attachment patterns are hurting the relationship, yeah, feel free to let that go because it's going to be a problem. And that goes both ways, for the anxiously attached and for the avoidant. So if you're anxiously attached and you're doing all the emotional work while your partner refuses to engage, that is absolutely not sustainable. And it's not fair to you, obviously. It's not healthy. It's not going to be healthy to your nervous system to be treating yourself in that way. And it's a valid deal breaker no matter how you turn it. So the only way this dynamic becomes healthy is when both people are willing to pause and regulate themselves, when they're willing to own their own part without dumping all the blame on the other person. That's when anxious avoidant can start to shift into something stable. Not perfect, but secure enough to build on. We are madly attracted to that oppositional kind of energy. And we'll talk more about why that is in a future video, but at the bottom of it, the anxious and the avoidant are often reflecting each other in a very interesting and compelling way. They're seeing each other's shadows play out. And that's not necessarily healthy, but it is deeply magnetizing. So yeah, we'll get into all of that soon. So if you've been holding on to the belief that avoidants are just broken people or that they're too cold or incapable of love, I hope this helps you see things in a slightly better light. Avoidants are not the villains in these dynamics. They're not the enemy of connection. They're just people who learned very early on that connection was not safe. And they probably learned the hard way. They learned that showing your emotions and being close to other people meant being rejected and shamed and misunderstood. And yes, that can absolutely lead to a lot of disconnection in relationships. But it doesn't mean that they can't work with it. And it doesn't mean you can't work with it if both people are invested and willing. Avoidants are not evil. Their defenses just look more like absence. Whereas the anxious person's defenses look more like desperation for connection, right? At their worst. And when we focus only on the anxious person who's trying really hard or who's fighting for the relationship, we forget that trying in deeply unregulated ways is not always healthy either. It can look like panic and control and jealousy or conflict and arguments, but you would still call that dysregulation. So just keep this in mind. Attachment style is only a starting point. What actually matters is this. Is the person I'm trying to relate to interested and willing to grow? Are they willing to take responsibility for their part in this dynamic? Are we both willing to extend ourselves just enough to meet somewhere in the middle? Not one person doing all of the emotional labor and not one person stuck in constant overwhelm, but both of you showing up and slowly choosing something better. Because if the answer is yes, then yes, you can build something real, even if you both started out insecure in different ways, even if you've made some mistakes and the whole thing was messy for a while. The most important thing is to choose people who choose you back. I don't know how to emphasize that harder, because their willingness to be in the connection and their desire to relationship with you in the first place, that matters more than any style of relating that they start out with. That's how healing even gets a chance to start, with people who want to show up. If you enjoy this kind of content, consider liking, subscribing, and we can keep doing this together. Until next time.